The transfer window is closed. Arsenal made 8 signings and managed to move another 4 out on deadline day. On today, Andrea Berta's role in his first transfer window since taking over as the club's sporting director. Plus, we'll look into the latest of our summer signings. What will Piero HINCAPIE bring to an already solid defensive unit? All that plus loads more on this episode of the Chronicles of a Gooner Pod. Let's get into it. Hey everybody, how we doing? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of the Chronicles of a Gooner podcast. With me, your host, Harry Symeou. I hope you're all well. I hope you're all having a wonderful day so far. I, like, I don't know what it is. Like, is it because the window's just closed? Is it because this is the first day since my kid was born a week ago now that I've not been like crazy busy and had a million and one things to think about? But I feel like I've crashed. And often I feel this after the end of a transfer window. So I wonder if that's just as big a part to do with it as, you know, the fact that I've had a mental week. But yeah, I feel like I've crashed a little bit, but in a good way. Like, I feel like I can relax. I feel like there's a weight off of my shoulders because obviously things are less intense as a result of the transfer window closing, because we went for a period where we had football to cover, but also all the transfer stuff as well, which can get quite draining. But on top of that, like, this little break, I think it's come at a nice time. I do. I wish that we picked up a more positive result going into it, because sadly, the discourse from the Liverpool game is going to last a lot longer as a result of that being our last game before a break. You don't have that opportunity to go out a few days later and put right the wrongs. But I do feel in a pretty comfortable place, actually, with the business that Arsenal have done in this window, in particular the incomings. Look, the outgoings, we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the show, because the outgoings are still a problem for me. You know, as much as I want to give Arsenal their flowers for a fantastic transfer window with regards to those that they've managed to bring in, you still feel like that issue of not being able to sell for decent amounts of money, and in a lot of cases not being able to sell at all, to the point where we're pushing players out on loan on deadline day that in an ideal world we'd have liked to have move on a more kind of permanent basis. So that is still an issue for us. It's an issue, if we're being honest, that Andrea Berta has inherited. I mean, he's a magic worker, and obviously he has done some wonderful things with regards to the players that we've signed, but he's clearly not powerful enough. I don't think anybody is really to put right that issue just in an instant. So that is the one negative, if you like, but it's a very small negative in comparison to the size of the positives, right? Because this has just been an incredible window, an unprecedented window as far as Arsenal are concerned. And we rounded up deadline day on a bonus episode of the pod that we put out very, very late on Monday night. It is the last video on the YouTube channel, so you can go back and check that out if you're a podcast listener. It will be the last episode on your feed, where we rounded up what had happened on deadline day, not just from an Arsenal perspective. Obviously, there was a focus on what Arsenal have been doing, but we talked a little bit about the Alexander Isak thing, the Mark Gay deal. It was off, it was on, then it was off again. So we covered that sort of thing. How on earth did Chelsea get 70 plus million quid for Nicholas Jackson? We did all of that. Today, I want to kind of draw a bit of a line under our window. And rather than going over all the signings, which we've done to death over the course of the summer, I want to focus on the latest arrival, the newest arrival, Piero HINCAPIE, because we haven't had a chance and an opportunity to really kind of look into him with any great details. I've done a bit of that this morning, and I've got some thoughts that I'd like to share with you guys. And we're also going to focus on Andrea Berta and his first transfer window as Arsenal sporting director. And there's a really interesting piece in The Athletic from James McNicholas this morning that kind of gives us some really, really interesting insights into how things have gone, what his role entails, what his strengths are, the issues that he maybe hasn't been able to resolve, notably that kind of selling issue that we clearly as a football club have. And people keep saying, well, look, no, we don't have an issue in that sense. But if we could raise money the way that Liverpool do, then we could have 400 million pound summers. If we could raise money in the way that Chelsea do, then we could continuously spend this way. Whereas, at Arsenal, because we don't have that ability to generate big money from the players that we sign, and that can be traced back to recruitment in the first place in a lot of cases, right? The signings of Sambi Lokonga, of Fabio Vieira, for instance, it's not to single them out, it's just the first two names that popped into my head. Those are two signings that didn't really work out, did they? We spent over 50 million pounds combined on those two players, and we've ended up letting one of them go out on a loan with an option for Hamburg to buy him. I'm talking about Fabio Vieira, an option that I'm pretty confident that they're not going to take up. So we're going to have him back, and then we're going to have to work that out again. And then you've got Lokonga, who, okay, look, if it's true, as was reported by The Sun yesterday, that we got around about 10 million for Lokonga, we basically got half of his value, half of what we paid for him a few years after he's been underwhelming and has gone out and had some underwhelming loan spells. That's not the worst bit of business in the world. In fact, I would argue to get 50% of what you paid for him back then is pretty good going, actually. But, we've got this issue, and I suppose the argument that people will make is they'll say, yeah, look, Liverpool raised money over the course of the summer, but they sold people like Luis Diaz, who was a very, very important part of their first team. And then people would argue back and say, well, we could have sold Gabriel Martinelli, for instance, right? So that's where Liverpool are willing to and have been willing to make big changes that maybe we haven't just yet with regards to some of our current first teamers and those in and around the starting 11, that first sort of 14, 15 players or whatever it is. We've tried to move Zinchenko on. In the end, we've moved him on, but again, it's just on a straight loan deal. So the only real benefit to us is that we probably save some of his salary, but that's it. He's going to leave for a free at the end of the window. So yeah, it still feels like we're missing a trick on that side of things. And I'm not really sure what the magic solution is to that. Is it just simply recruit better? And if you recruit better, there'll be higher demand for your players. Therefore, there'll be more competition when the transfer windows come along for their signatures. And by default and by nature, that creates a much healthier market around them. I don't know. But anyway, it's not what we're here to talk about. It's just one element that did frustrate me a little bit on deadline day, because I thought we'd get a little bit more for the players that we allowed to leave. We are going to talk Hincapié, as I say. We are going to talk Andrea Berta as well, too. Really interesting subjects, I think. If you haven't done so already, please leave a like on the video. It really, really does help. And subscribe to the channel if you are new. If you're listening to us on Apple or Spotify or any other podcast store, please do leave us a review as well. All of that stuff really, really does help. We're going to start with Piero HINCAPIE. What will he bring to Arsenal? What can we expect from the Ecuadorian, who is signed on loan? But of course, Arsenal's intention is to make that a permanent deal come the end of the season. What will he bring? So Piero HINCAPIE, just based on what I knew of him prior to Arsenal being seriously linked, he just feels like the archetypal Mikel Arteta defender. Tall, powerful, physical, strong, a centre-back naturally, but one that can play as a fullback as well. And when you think about what Arteta has done with the likes of Ben White, Jurriën Timber, Ricardo Calafiori, just to name a few, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? You can understand why HINCAPIE was someone that Arteta was keen to bring in. I think what's really, really interesting is when you dig into some of his underlying metrics and you really do your homework on Piero HINCAPIE, there's this really cool feature on FB Ref where what it does is it takes the attributes of a player and how they rank in each of those metric points, essentially, and it finds players that you can compare them to stylistically just based on the numbers. And one of the players that came up, and I thought this was really interesting, was Dean Howson, formerly of Bournemouth, now of Real Madrid, a player that we knew earlier in the window Arsenal were looking at and Arsenal were interested in, a player that we knew Arsenal had a long-term admiration for. So for that reason, this pivot to Piero HINCAPIE, it actually makes quite a bit of sense. Now, we've obviously lost Jakub Kiwior. I've said before, and I'll say it again, I believe that Jakub Kivior's departure was mainly driven by him. I don't think Arsenal were desperate to move him out. I don't think Arsenal were unhappy with him. I think that he did a really, really good job when he came into the side at the back end of last season, and he showed people what he can do when he played in his preferred position of left centre back. But Jakub Kivior can't really play left back, I don't think. He did it for a period of time and he was okay, but I don't think it's really something that comes naturally to him in the way that it does for other centre backs, right? You know, we know that the way we play means that even if we're not playing with a centre back at left back, our left centre back, because of the way we push our fullback into midfield, is going to have to be comfortable in those spaces because we spread as a back three. And Gabriel, you'll see a lot of the time marshalling that left hand side. So for me, it's really, really important that our left centre back can do that. And that's where Piero HINCAPIE is probably just a little bit more compatible to this Arsenal side, system, and setup than Jakub Kivior ever was. But yeah, look, he's a really interesting player because if you, as I say, look into the metrics, he's a really high performer in the attacking metrics compared to some of the other centre backs, that play across Europe's top 5 leagues. And I think, there's a bit of the Ricardo Calafiores about him. I think that's maybe what the attraction was for Arsenal. But if I look at the players that he's been compared with by FBref, I'm looking at Bisek at Inter, who's a sort of centre back that's very left leaning. Strahinja Pavlovic, another one, very, very similar. Berat Jimsiti at Atalanta, who I commentated on at the weekend, very, very sort of left-leaning central defender. Lisandro Martinez, who we know that Arsenal had an admiration for prior to him joining Manchester United. Dean Howson is another one of those players that's been mentioned as well. And so for that reason, I think you can agree that in terms of his profile and style and the ability to kind of plug and play him into this system that we currently operate with, I think it works quite well. I like it. I think it was interesting listening to Andy Brassel on Sky Sports News last night. Andy Brassel is a European football expert, a very good friend of mine as well. And I have to say, I don't know anybody that has that level and depth of knowledge about European football, and he's able to be so across so many different leagues and so many clubs and so many competitions. I just think he's remarkable at what he does. And I was listening to him speak about Piero HINCAPIE last night, and I'm always interested when he speaks. And he said when HINCAPIE first arrived in Germany, I think there was a sort of a general kind of consensus that this guy, physically he's there. Mentally, in terms of his desire to succeed and his passion for the game, he's absolutely there. But there was just a feeling that he was a little bit raw, like a little bit rough around the edges, bit of a diamond in the rough, as was Big Gabby, by the way, when he came from French football to Arsenal, as was Laurent Koscielny when he first came to Arsenal, I felt. And he got better and better and better. He was polished, if you like, by the great coaches that they had around them at the time. And I think you can say that of so many players, young centre backs. You look at them and you go, has he got it? Yeah, it's there, but I need a coach to just polish him up a little bit and get that top level out of him. And it feels like Xabi Alonso did a really fantastic job of achieving that with HINCAPIE. Now, Xabi Alonso is one of Europe's most highly rated coaches. It's why he was appointed as the Real Madrid boss over the summer. You look at what that Bayer Leverkusen team achieved under him. You look at some of the individual players that have developed and gone on to another level there and then progressed to other clubs. By the way, can we just mention, if we're talking Bayer Leverkusen, Erik ten Hag sacked 2 games into the season. Was it 2 or 3? I don't even know. Regardless, Erik ten Hag is a guy whose stock is falling, isn't it, all the time right now. But anyway, that's a side point. Sorry, I just felt I needed to mention it. But yeah, look, he's a player that, as I say, has been sort of coached and has been improved and has been developed and has got to a point now where he's ready to make that step up. And Arsenal in the Premier League is certainly that step up. I said that he ranks very similar to Dean Howson in a lot of metrics. And what that does is it gives me an encouragement with regards to kind of how I feel about Arsenal's recruitment process overall. Because in the past, and you know, you can take this right back to the end of the Arsene Wenger days, if you like. You know, there were times where Arsenal would go into a window, would leave things late, and then would be really kind of panicky at the end and end up signing players that maybe were never the right options, but out of desperation more than anything else. And there was a period at Arsenal where you felt like the recruitment strategy was completely missing. And then we tried to address that by bringing in people like Sven Mislintat. Do you remember? He was a scout more than anything else. And our recruitment strategy was shaped in a very specific way, and in a way that Sven Mislintat thought was right. Over time, I think we found that recruitment strategy wasn't working great for us either. And we had to make the change and we had to move on. But the point I'm trying to make here is that when I try and delve into the subject of recruitment strategy, and recruitment strategy is something that's very, very hard to analyze, by the way, because unless you are in the room, unless you are sitting there and you are privy to what the priorities are, it's quite hard, isn't it, to know full well what those priorities are. You can guess. For example, you know, you look at Mikel Arteta's defensive signings over the years, and there's a trend. He tends to sign players of a certain age profile. He tends to sign players of a certain physical profile, and he tends to like players that are centre backs but have the capacity to operate as fullbacks as well, because in his system, he sees that as really, really important. He doesn't like the idea, I don't think, of opposition teams being able to drop balls over the top of our fullbacks and get in behind and hurt us that way. And listen, whatever we've said and debated over the last few days following that disappointing result at Anfield, you can't deny that defensively, Mikel Arteta is a top coach. You know, we can have the conversation about the attack. We can have the conversation about whether at times he's too pragmatic, whether he's gone too far that way. And I'd absolutely entertain that conversation. I think it's a really interesting debate. But what you can't deny is that defensively he can set up a team, and defensively he can recruit, and Arsenal can recruit. And Piero HINCAPIE feels like the latest in a long line of really solid defensive recruits that can play hybrid roles and that can really help Arsenal in terms of maintaining those really high defensive standards. Now, you would look at HINCAPIE and you would say, with Kivior gone, you know, he could come in and play left centre back, for Gabriel. You would look at Mosquera now, as we saw at Anfield, and say he can come in and play at right centre back. Plus, you've got White and Timber, who can both play at right back, but also have the capacity to tuck inside. And on the left side, you've got Calafiori and Miles Lewis-Skelly, with Calafiori having that capacity to come inside and play as a centre half as well. So we've built a really, really strong defensive unit. We really, really have, and that's great. And you need to keep refreshing that and renewing that, right? It's not a case of we signed defenders 3 years ago, we don't sign defenders anymore. No, right? But I think HINCAPIE is as compatible a find as you're gonna find, basically. And so I quite like that signing. And I think we're going to see someone who's powerful. I think we're going to see someone who's strong. I think we're going to see someone who's determined. And I think he's going to turn out to be a good signing for Arsenal. I do want to touch on some ins and outs of the HINCAPIE deal, but we're going to do that a little bit later on when we talk about Andrea Berta, because he was instrumental in this. He was at the forefront of making this happen, and I think it's important that we give him the credit for it. So we'll do that after this very, very short pause. We're going to take a really short break, and then when we come back, we're going to get into Andrea Berta's first transfer window as Arsenal's sporting director. Remember, if you're watching us live on YouTube, don't forget to leave a like on the video, not in the chat box, but on the video itself. Subscribe to the channel if you're new as well. If you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, or any other podcast platform, please do leave us a review. We'll be back in just a second. We're going to talk Andrea Berta, and following that, we're going to take some of your questions and thoughts from the live chat. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to the Chronicles of a Gooner.
You're listening to the Chronicles of a Gooner. Like and subscribe.
That's right. You're listening to the Chronicles of a Gooner podcast with me, Harry Symeou. Like and subscribe. Okay, shall we talk about Andrea Berta, Arsenal's new sporting director? Still new, relatively, I suppose. And lots of people have said, he's the difference maker. You look at the way that Arsenal have operated this summer versus the way that we've operated in previous summers. And it's just incredible, the difference. Now, I want to be really careful in this conversation because I want to make sure that we give Andrea Berta the credit for the things that he has done. But I also want to give credit to the ownership here, who I've been critical of a lot in the past, a hell of a lot, who I started to question again last summer when it felt like Arsenal were reluctant for whatever reason to do the kind of business that was going to consolidate their position right towards the top end of the league. And okay, we had a really unprecedented season in terms of the volume of injuries that we dealt with, but we ended up falling off quite a bit. And although we finished second and made a Champions League final, the Champions League bit was a remarkable achievement, by the way. I don't care what anyone says. We did fall a long way behind the eventual Premier League champions, Liverpool, and that was disappointing. It was. We got to the semis of the League Cup and we weren't able to get over the line and get to Wembley and go to the final. But, you know, I think a lot of that frustration at the time was then traced back to what happened last summer, which was that Arsenal underwhelmed in the window. You fast forward to the point where Edu leaves and Arsenal have a real big decision to make and they've got to go out and bring in a new sporting director. I did fear at the time, and I say fear not out of disrespect to Jason Ato, but I did fear that we were going to take the easy option, which was to give Jason Ato the job because he'd been working alongside Edu, knew the ins and outs, understood the inner workings of the football club. When I say that, I don't mean it disrespectfully to Jason Ato, but I felt like there was a really crap summer window the summer before. Then you had a January window where everybody could see that we needed reinforcements. We didn't make those moves. We didn't bring in those reinforcements. And Jason Ato, although he probably wasn't the only one that didn't want to make those signings or didn't push in the direction that many of us as fans felt he should, I always said it at the time. I felt like if he got the job, he would have been swimming against the tide because there was already a kind of negative public opinion of him. Because if you're the sporting director or interim sporting director, whatever he was at the time in terms of the technical term, and Arsenal don't do what people think they should do and then end up falling off, then people are going to look at you. And if you've got that already kind of negative reputation among large sections of the supporter base, and then you take on a big role like the permanent sporting director's role at Arsenal, you're swimming against the tide and you're making it very, very difficult for him. Arsenal went out and got the best in class in Andrea Berta. I've said this before, I'll say it again. You know, we went through a number of options at the time on this podcast. We talked through them. We talked about their past experiences, where they'd worked previously, where they'd succeeded, where maybe they'd failed. And in the end, we decided as a podcast, as a live chat, as a community, that the best option was Andrea Berta. And I will tip my hat to KSE because they went and got him. Not only did they go and get him, but they really seriously backed him this summer. And that, for me, at least tells me that for now, the ambition remains there. And me questioning that last summer, last January, I think it was fair at the time, but I think what they've done is proved me wrong, proved to me that they do want to win. And I wonder how much of an influence someone like Andrea Berta has had when he's come in. You know, has it been one of those situations whereby he's come in and gone, look, I'm only taking the job if you allow me to go and do X, Y, and Z, because that's what this team needs. That's what this team is crying out for. That's what it's screaming out for. And unless we do that business, we're not going to succeed here. And if we're not going to succeed and we give ourselves no chance of succeeding, I don't really want to be here. So I think Andrea Berta must have had some influence on the really kind of aggressive approach of this summer from the ownership. But then he's still got to go out and execute the deals, and he's done just brilliantly. And there's a fantastic piece in The Athletic this morning written by James Nicholas that kind of gives us a bit of insight into Andrea Berta, how he operates, and we're going to run through some of the key points from that now, because I think there's a lot worth unpacking and discussing in there. Okay, so there was a few lines that really kind of jumped out at me that I've decided to kind of make a note of to share with you and discuss. James McNicholas writes, In an age of self-promotion, Berta is discreet. I like that about Andrea Berta. I do. I feel like there's a time when you're making your way in any industry that you really kind of need to work hard to put yourself out there. And you really need to work hard to put yourself in a position where people are noticing you and people are talking about you and people are thinking of you when they're looking for someone to fill a potential role or to do a potential job. Okay. But there comes a point where you get past that, I think, and where you can then focus on the quality of your work, knowing that you already have that reputation, knowing that you already have that kind of weight within your industry. And at that point, you can go, right, I don't need to do interviews. I don't need to do appearances. I don't need to do any of that stuff. All I need to do is do my job and do my job well. And that will speak for itself. James McNicholas also said that Andrea Berta prefers to let his business do the talking, and it has. My God, has it. It absolutely has. Andrea Berta's come in. He's kind of come in like a silent assassin. He's come in without talking a great deal. He's not as comfortable, I don't think, a communicator as Edu was in terms of facing the public. But he's worked behind the scenes. He's always in and around things. I mean, I've spotted him at the training ground when I've been to some of the trainings, the media training sessions. I've spotted him right at the beginning of his Arsenal career, walking out onto the training pitch with a cup of coffee in a suave suit and thinking, how many sporting directors are out on the training pitch? But what he was doing was he was sussing the place out. He was sussing the players out. He was trying to figure out the group and understand the dynamic a little bit better. He's very, very quiet, but in the negotiation room, he is an absolute beast. That's what Andrea Berta is. He's a deal maker. He's very straight to the point. He's very abrupt by all accounts. He's a very un-Arsenal-like figure. That's what a member of one of the other Premier League clubs' hierarchy has had to say anonymously about Andrea Berta. He's very un-Arsenal-like. And in a way, that's a good thing, because Arsenal have always had a reputation of doing things in a certain way that maybe made them appear a little bit soft when it came to negotiations and those difficult conversations. Whereas here's this guy who walks in with this really ruthless nature, doesn't say a great deal, but he's straight to the point. And as we've just said, the business he's done has spoken for itself. He doesn't need to give you an interview. He doesn't need to go on Sky Sports News, join Jim White on Talk Sport. He doesn't need to do any of that stuff. You simply need to look through the list of players that Arsenal have signed this summer and look at the prices for the vast majority of them. And if you do that, you'll see that he's got really, really good deals versus the way the market looks and the market values, you would argue, of those players. And he's brought in top quality players in a lot of departments. And he's given Mikel Arteta, and this was another line from the piece, I think this was the final line, he's given Mikel Arteta the deepest Arsenal squad in a generation. That's how James McNicholas put it. Now it's time to deliver. If you're a manager, you cannot ask any more of Andrea Berta. You just can't. He's gone out in the summer. He's brought you 8 players in. Okay, 8. Some of them are needle movers. Some of them are squad players. But he's brought you 8 players in, and he's addressed every single need that this Arsenal team had going into the summer. Now, we all thought a striker was a priority. And obviously, Berta's conviction around Victor Gyökeres has played a big part in Arsenal going and getting him. And also Mikel Arteta, according to James McNicholas, being convinced of the player's suitability. The only thing, and again, you can't really blame him for this, that he's struggled to do is to help us with the sales. And I hope that in time we'll find a solution to that. The better the recruitment, the easier it is to sell later down the line. That is fact. And I think while we've done some good recruitment over the years, and we did some good recruitment under Arteta and Edu as a combination, there was some poor recruitment in there as well. And it's no coincidence that the majority of the players that we're trying to move out and we're struggling to move out for good amounts of money are players that you would put into that poor recruitment category. So there is a correlation between how well you recruit and how well you sell. Okay, you think about Vieira, £35 million. We paid a lot of money for him at the time, and it didn't work. It didn't work. So then what can you realistically expect to get back for him when everybody knows that it didn't work and everybody's watching him? Lokonga, I liked the look of Lokonga when we signed him, and I was behind that signing. So I'm not going to have a go and have a pop at the club for signing him at that time, because I looked at him and I thought, yeah, this guy's got it. But it hasn't worked out for a number of reasons. And so when it comes to selling him, to think that you're going to get what you paid or more, it's unrealistic, isn't it? It's unrealistic. Now, if we did, as I said earlier in the pod, get 10 million there or thereabouts for Lokonga, I think actually that's pretty good going, given his contract situation and given how the last few years have gone for him. But I think what really kind of jumped out to me from this piece in The Athletic was the kind of bits and pieces that really do highlight and indicate Andrea Berta's deal-making capacity, and B, how creative he can be in a sort of transfer negotiation. I think that is massive, and I think that's helped us hugely. Let's take the Piero HINCAPIE deal, for example. This is a real clear indicator and sign of just how creative Andrea Berta can be in a transfer negotiation, because ultimately him thinking outside of the box is what's allowed us to do this deal. Now, Arsenal ideally did not want to spend another 50 plus million euros in this transfer window for financial reasons. Okay. So you got to be careful. When we talk about it a lot, there's a difference between the Premier League's PSR rules and the UEFA financial fair play rules. And while it might look like we're really comfortable in the Premier League's kind of model, we might not have been as comfortable in the UEFA model. And that is why there was a level at which we essentially had to stop spending. If Arsenal had bought Piero HINCAPIE, in the sense of, if Arsenal had negotiated with Bayer Leverkusen a loan like they have, with an obligation to buy, which is, I'm sure, what Bayer Leverkusen would have wanted once they realized that it wasn't just going to be a straight transfer, then that money would have gone down as a spend on this accounting period. Okay. So to get around that, it had to be an option to buy at the end of this loan spell. Now, if you're Bayer Leverkusen, why on earth would you accept that? Why would you, okay, if you're Bayer Leverkusen, go, you know what? We'll let you have him for a season, but we're going to do it because we trust you and we trust that you're going to take him, and you're not going to renege, see him get injured, decide he's not a good fit for you, and go, actually, we don't want to buy him, and leave us in the lurch. Actually, Bayer Leverkusen were never going to be okay with that, were they? And I remember a similar thing when we signed David Raya from Brentford. I remember going, why have they allowed their goalkeeper to go out on loan with just an option? It's not even an obligation. At least with an obligation, you're guaranteed to get your money, albeit a little bit later down the line. Why would they allow that to happen? It's come to light that Brentford's strong relationship with Arsenal and the verbal agreement that happened between the two clubs meant that Brentford felt comfortable enough to go ahead with that. But the workaround here with HINCAPIE, and the workaround that ultimately convinced Bayer Leverkusen that this is something that they should be comfortable with and move ahead with, was that Andrea Berta came up with the idea of providing both clubs with the option of triggering a compulsory purchase, meaning that if Arsenal didn't want to do it, Bayer Leverkusen could do it, right? Triggering it. So that comfort that they had, knowing that they could do that in the event that Arsenal changed their minds, that is ultimately what saw this deal get over the line. So he's navigated all the issues brilliantly. He's avoided that spend going down on this current accounting period, which would have been bad news for Arsenal, by doing it loan initially with a fee, and then the deal to be done later down the line. But he couldn't do it as an obligation, because if he did it as an obligation, that money would come out of that accounting period, regardless of when the payment was actually made, because at that point you are promising essentially to spend that money. So he's had to work his way around that. And he's also had to give Bayer Leverkusen something that makes them feel comfortable enough to proceed with this deal, and giving them the option of triggering a compulsory purchase that's what they needed. That's what they got. And that's why this deal essentially went through. Now, in the unlikely event, according to James McNicholas, neither club want to do the deal. Something very similar was put into Jakub Kivior's move to Porto. Okay. And this is why those two deals were very, very much intertwined, reliant upon one another. And this is why the negotiations were a little bit complex and maybe took a little bit longer than people would have liked in an ideal world. But Berta's creativity in terms of the way he thinks and the way he negotiates, that's, according to this piece, what has impressed Arsenal Football Club the most. And when you hear stories like that, you can understand why. You can understand why. The piece also goes on to mention the contract negotiations with Saliba and Saka, which are ongoing at the moment. There's a confidence within Arsenal Football Club that those two negotiations will come to a successful conclusion. And I'll tell you this, right? You know, if you were Saka and Saliba and you were sitting there and you were going, I like being here. I enjoy being here. You know, I still think we've got more to give here, but I want to see a real show of strength from this football club in the summer in terms of the signings that they make. I want them to show me that we are ready to push harder than we've pushed in recent years, even because I want to know, if I'm committing my peak years to this football club, that the football club has the same level of ambition as I do. If ever there was a window to show ambition, if ever there was a window in the history of Arsenal Football Club that screamed, we are damn serious and we want to get over the line, this was it. And so I'd imagine that that's played a significant part in why Arsenal are feeling particularly confident about getting those deals done for Saliba and Saka. I mean, what more can you do to show them that your ambition matches theirs? I mean, going and getting Gyökeres, Eze, Zubimendi, you know, and all the other signings that we brought in over the course of summer. Mosquera, I'm so excited about Mosquera, by the way. I think, you know, I think we've done really, really well this window, and I think that's gone a long way in just, you know, I think increasing the want of those two players to stay and making them feel a lot more comfortable about signing on the dotted line, and, as I say, committing some of their best years to this football club. Andrea Berta has made a big impact, guys. There's no question about that. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. And as much as I was very defensive of Edu in the past because I felt that he was blamed for things that weren't necessarily his fault, I think what this has taught me is that, you know, no matter how talented you are at something, no matter how liked you are, how good a communicator you are, experience is so damn important, isn't it? Experience is so damn important. Like, and I've found this quite a lot in sort of my working life in recent years. You know, I've at times, I think, been asked to do things that I probably wasn't ready to do in terms of where I was at as a broadcaster. But I took them on because I felt like they were too good at opportunities to miss. Some people, when you get thrown in the deep end, you drown. Sometimes you get through it without doing amazingly, but you take learns away from it. And that's really, really important. And I feel like that's what I've done a lot, is got through something without exactly acing it. But at the same time, I've taken away some really, really valuable lessons. But mileage, miles on the clock, that's really important, I think, in everything that you do. And Andrea Berta has got that over Edu, and that has shown in the way that he's negotiated far more swiftly, in the way that he's negotiated better prices, in the way that he's been more creative, thinking outside of the box. His experience would have seen him come across situations like the HINCAPIE and Bayer Leverkusen one before, where you're like, oh, we don't really want to do an obligation to buy because of the accounting implications, but I've got to give the club that I'm taking the player from something to make them feel confident and allow them to sign this off. If you're experienced, you'd have seen these things before. You'd have come across similar scenarios, maybe not identical ones, but similar ones at the very least. And that gives you the opportunity to dip into previous experiences and say, okay, how did we resolve it then? What was the solution? Can I use a similar solution here? Can I suggest something similar here? I think it puts him in a really, really great position. And I think, you know, in terms of the window, it's been really, really good. I think the one thing I took away from the no, there was a few things I took away. Let me be fair. I don't know why I've worded it like that. There's a few things I took away from this James McNicholas piece. The thing that struck me, though, when I was reading it was he's been so instrumental in the signing of Victor Gyökeres. And while he's gone out and got lots of other very good players and improved the Arsenal squad a fair bit, I'd imagine that he's going to be quite heavily judged based on how that Gyökeres signing goes. And obviously, we've had 3 games. He's got 2 Premier League goals. You can't knock him. I know some people would like to, but you can't. I think for me, he's got to hit a decent amount of goals this season for people to look at that signing and go, yeah, it was an effective one, because there've just been a few signings, haven't there? There've been a few signings where we've gone, well, did that really, really work? Or, we've watched Gyökeres a couple of times now and gone, I'm not really sure it's working out. We need that one to work. Andrea Berta needs that one to work because it's so clear and so obvious that he was the big driving force, at least initially. I'm not saying that Arteta didn't want him and that Arteta wasn't convinced. I think he was. But I think when you're the big driving force behind the signing as a sporting director, you need that signing to work. And the more of those work, the better your reputation becomes, the greater the trust in you from not just those within the club, but those that follow the club as well. And yeah, so let's see how that's going to pan out. Hopefully it goes well. Let's take a couple of comments and a couple of thoughts from you guys before we sign out. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't done so already, be sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you are brand new. Don't forget to leave us a review as well if you're listening on Apple or Spotify. Okay, let's go into the live chat for the last few minutes of the show. Steve has been very, very impressed with Mosquera. He says, what I've seen of him, he looks top quality. I'm impressed. Yeah, me too. Let's roll through the chat a little bit more and see. There's a lot of complainers in the chat today. Just people trying to banter. It's not really that funny, to be honest with you. So yeah, Zamud says Leverkusen gave us their starting defender on loan. Imagine when they can sell. Yeah. I mean, there's so much nonsense, man. Honestly, in the chat, I'm sorry. This is the first time on today's stream that I'm really kind of looking into it in detail. Twerk for Work says, Harry, I estimated we saved about 20 million in wages from the players that went out on loan. Better than nothing, I suppose. Yeah, and I think that's ultimately why you have to allow those deals to go through on deadline day, even if the terms are not ideal for you. And it's why I've been saying throughout the summer that those that are interested in our fringe players, if you like, the players that we're happy to let go, they're going to come in late because they'll know that they'll get favorable terms. And they have. That's exactly how it's played out, isn't it? MP says, Harry, do you think Miles Lewis-Skelly will get a chance in midfield now? It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because he gives us the sort of the option to go into midfield. I wouldn't be against it, man. I wouldn't be against it. I think with Miles Lewis-Skelly, he was unbelievable last season. There were a few mistakes along the way that I think were sort of covered up by some of his really outstanding performances and really outstanding moments, right? I think with Miles Lewis-Skelly, it might be difficult for him to understand and to accept and to process at the beginning. But I actually think it's healthy that we're taking Miles Lewis-Skelly out of the firing line a little bit, just like I felt it was healthy for Ethan Nwaneri at certain points last season as well, because, they were both kind of thrust into the team, more so Lewis-Skelly than Nwaneri, because he was kind of on the radar for a little bit longer. He was thrown into the team. He did amazingly well. There were a few mistakes, but the standards are so high at Arsenal. There's going to be so many games. You're going to get opportunities to play. I don't think Mikel Arteta distrusts him or doesn't feel like he can play at left back, but there's got to be some kind of meritocracy. And right now, Ricardo Calafiori is playing unbelievably well. I would argue, he scored the winner at Old Trafford. He was arguably our best player against Liverpool. And he was the one that unlocked Victor Gyökeres against Leeds. You could make a case that he's been our best player this season. And so if you're Miles Lewis-Skelly, you'll be disappointed that you're not playing right now. But if you're the manager, it's really kind of easy to justify, isn't it? Because he's been phenomenal. When he's out, when I want to rotate, you'll get your chance. You'll get your opportunity. You'll be back in. But for now, Riccardo Calafiori is making that position his own. And if Miles Lewis-Skelly is your backup, then that in itself speaks to the level that we have in the squad now, doesn't it? Jid says, Harry, it will be interesting to see how Arteta manages 25 players, most of whom are used to being starters. This is not even including the likes of Harriman and Noose. 25 players, 11 starters per game, 9 bench seats available, and 5 substitutions allowed. That means 5 players not even on a match day squad. Guess some players will have to wait for injuries or FA Cup third round in Jan to get some mins. Well, that's just the way it is, mate. Like, you can't bemoan the lack of quality and the lack of depth that has ultimately seen us fall short in the past, and then complain when you have the depth about how you're going to fit everybody in. How does every other big club do it? They find a way. And having that big squad in terms of its quality rather than just the volume as well is why the likes of Chelsea and Liverpool have been able to sell players as well. So maybe that'll help us come the end of this season or January solve that problem too. I don't know, but this is where Arteta's got to figure it out. And this is why people are very much of the opinion now that it's kind of over to him. And we all appreciate that football has many, many variables, and there'll be things that are out of his control, and things will go wrong. Some things will go right. Sometimes you get the rub of the green. Sometimes you don't. But ultimately, you know, as a top manager at a top club, you've got to be able to manage this type of situation. And I've talked a lot about how Arteta's going to have to get used to that. He's going to have to be more open-minded when it comes to rotation. And the only way, he'll feel comfortable in doing that is if he has a better squad. Well, he's got the better squad now, so it's over to him, in my opinion. Ganto says, do you think Arteta's fixation on getting defenders more than attackers plays into his reputation for setting up not to lose instead of a winning mindset? Maybe, but honestly, I don't think Mikel Arteta gives a shit about what people think his mindset is, to be honest. Honestly, I just think he's made Arsenal competitive again. He wants to get over the line. That's all that matters now. And we are Arsenal Football Club, and we are going to get shit in the media and from rival fans, regardless of what we do. I mean, I'm sure you guys came across it. David Raya, in his Sky interview after the game at Anfield, was asked about the ball. He was asked about the new balls. And Sky go and put out a clip of David Raya, and it starts off with him talking about the balls. Like, why don't you include the question for context? There isn't a time limit on the length of the video anymore. When you're posting on X, why don't you put the question in to provide the context? Because the amount of posts I saw from rival fans going, this guy's pathetic, this club are pathetic, they lost, and all they're doing is moaning about the ball. No, they weren't moaning about the ball. They were asked about the ball. Mikel Arteta was asked about the ball in a recent press conference, and that got blown up into something it wasn't either. So whatever Mikel does, whatever Arsenal do, people are out there and they are gunning for us. That's the way it goes. Big club, big fan base, big reputation. People want your blood. And that is the situation that we find ourselves in again. Not for the first time. We've got to get used to it. That's why I think it's really, really important that we as supporters of this great football club do not get drawn in and sucked into that nonsense. Okay? Because if we start reacting to that and arguing among ourselves, we just contributing to that unhelpful noise, and we are also validating essentially those ridiculous sort of narratives that are doing the rounds about our football club. So that's where I'm at. That's where I'm at on that. But is his reputation affected? Maybe, quite possibly, man, quite possibly. Okay, guys, I think I'm going to love you and leave you. Thank you so much for joining me. As always, I really, really do appreciate the love and support. Don't forget to leave a like on the video if you haven't done so already. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you are brand new. All of that stuff really, really does help. Check us out on Patreon as well. Should have said this earlier on in the show. Go onto our Patreon and you'll find some video analysis from the Liverpool game. That's our latest bit of Patreon content. Go over and check it out. Patreon.com/The Chronicles of Aguna. The link is in the description below. And I will see you all on the next episode. Until then, take care of yourselves and have a wonderful Tuesday. Up the Arsenal. Goodbye.